and the forest was quiet. Too quiet. Jenna and her friends had decided on a weekend camping trip to escape the monotony of their suburban lives. The Whispering Woods, as locals called it, were the perfect mix of serene and eerie, the kind of place where the canopy of trees felt endless, and the paths were overgrown with moss that muffled every step. Local legends spoke of strange happenings in the woods, disappearances, shadows that moved against the wind, an entity the townsfolk only referred to as the Goatman. Jenna, being the skeptic of the group, had laughed off the stories. "It's just an old folk tale," she'd said while packing her bag. "Besides, even if there's something out there, we'll have a fire and marshmallows. What's the worst that could happen?" The first day of the trip had been peaceful. They'd set up camp by a clearing near a creek, cooked over a fire, and told silly ghost stories. But as the sun began to set, the shadows around them lengthened unnaturally. The trees seemed to shift closer, and an oppressive silence blanketed the woods. No birds, no crickets, just the soft crackle of their campfire. Jenna noticed it first, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoing from the trees. "Do you guys hear that?" she whispered. "Probably just a woodpecker," Mike said, though his voice wavered. "No woodpecker taps in perfect threes," Jenna replied. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't tapping anymore, but heavy hoofbeats, uneven and slow. They shone their flashlights toward the woods, but the beams seemed swallowed by the darkness. Then came the voice, soft, mocking, and familiar. "Jenna?" She froze. It was her mother's voice. "Mom?" she called back instinctively, only to have her friends turn and look at her with confusion. "I didn't say anything," Jenna insisted. "No," whispered Sarah, her eyes wide. "I heard it too." The voice called again, this time more distorted, a sickening mimicry, like someone trying to remember how human voices worked. "Jenna, come here." "Don't move," Sarah hissed, grabbing Jenna's arm, but something stepped into the firelight. A figure, half hidden in shadow, its silhouette all wrong. It was tall, unnaturally so, with the twisted legs of a goat and a head crowned with jagged horns. Its face was a warped imitation of humanity, like a mask made of rotting leather. Its glowing eyes flicked toward each of them, then settled on Jenna. "Run," Mike breathed. The group scattered in different directions, the firelight vanishing behind them. Jenna's heart pounded as she tore through the dense underbrush. Branches clawed at her face and arms, but she didn't dare stop. Behind her, the sound of hooves crashing against the forest floor was deafening, relentless. She veered off the trail, hoping the thick trees would slow whatever was chasing her. As she stumbled over roots and rocks, the thing's voice called out again, louder this time, still wearing her mother's voice like a mask. "Jenna, come back. It's safe here. I'm waiting for you." She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block it out. But the voice wasn't coming from behind her anymore. It was ahead of her, to her left, to her right. It echoed through the trees circling her, closing in. She tripped over a root and hit the ground hard. Pain shot up her leg, but she scrambled to her feet, her flashlight spinning wildly on the ground. Its beam landed on something that made her blood run cold. A crude wooden effigy, a goat-like figure with hollow eyes and a noose around its neck. The hooves stopped. The silence was suffocating. Jenna held her breath, her eyes darting around the darkness. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, watching her, waiting. "Jenna," it whispered, now impossibly close. Her flashlight flickered, and for a split second she saw it. The Goatman stood less than 10 feet away, its grotesque form illuminated by the weak light. Its mouth twisted into something resembling a grin, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "No," Jenna whispered, backing away. "You're not real." It tilted its head, the movement unnatural, almost insect-like. Then it spoke again, but this time, it wasn't her mother's voice. "Who says I'm not real?" The thing lunged and Jenna screamed. But before it could reach her, a blinding white light engulfed the woods. She shielded her eyes, feeling an intense heat that seemed to burn away the darkness. When she opened her eyes, the Goatman was gone. So were the effigy and the unnatural silence. The forest was alive again, with the sound of wind rustling through the trees and distant animal calls. But she wasn't alone. Standing in the clearing was Sarah, wide-eyed and trembling, her face streaked with tears. "Sarah!" Jenna ran to her, grabbing her friend by the shoulders. "Are you okay? Where's Mike?" Sarah shook her head, unable to speak, but she managed to point towards the deeper woods. Jenna followed her gaze and saw it. Mike's flashlight lying on the ground, its beam shining weakly into the blackness. "Mike?" Jenna called out, her voice cracking. There was no answer, only the faint echo of her own voice. And then the tapping started again. The tapping was slower this time, deliberate. Each knock reverberated through the trees like a heartbeat, and Jenna felt her chest tighten with every sound. "Mike!" she yelled again, her voice breaking with desperation. Sarah grabbed her arm. "We have to go, now." "But Mike—" "Jenna, look!" Sarah pointed toward the flashlight on the ground. It wasn't just lying there. It was moving, being dragged slowly into the shadows. Something unseen gripped it, leaving a faint trail in the dirt. "Mike!" Jenna screamed, taking a step forward. Sarah yanked her back with surprising force. "That's not him. You know it's not him." Jenna froze, the reality of Sarah's words sinking in. The flashlight disappeared completely into the darkness, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the laughter. It was deep, guttural, and wrong. It sounded like a child trying to mimic an old man's voice, shifting pitches erratically. The laughter came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding them. Jenna's knees threatened to buckle. "What is that?" she whispered, clutching Sarah's arm. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know, but it's playing with us." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound far worse. Mike's voice. "Jenna, Sarah, over here." It was unmistakable, but it carried the same warped quality as the earlier mimicry. It came from the direction of the flashlight. Jenna's heart screamed at her to run, but her legs disobeyed. "What if it's him?" she whispered, half to herself. "Do you really think he'd be calling out like that after all this?" Sarah hissed, shaking her. "We have to go." But Jenna was already stepping forward, her gaze fixed on the blackness where the voice had come from. "Mike," she called, her voice trembling. "Help me," the voice replied, now faint, broken, and desperate. Something cracked in Jenna's resolve, and she bolted toward the sound before Sarah could stop her. The woods closed in around her as she ran, the shadows growing thicker and colder. "Mike!" she shouted, "Where are you?" "Jenna!" The voice came again, just ahead. She stumbled into another clearing, the moonlight barely piercing through the branches. At the center of the space stood another effigy, larger and more grotesque than the last. It was shaped like a goat-headed figure. But this one was adorned with scraps of clothing, bones, and something wet and red dripping from its hands. Jenna's stomach turned, and she took a step back, only to hear a low growl behind her. She spun around and came face to face with the Goatman. Its horns gleamed in the faint light, and its twisted smile was wider now, impossibly so. It raised one clawed hand and pointed toward the effigy. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. Draped over the effigy was a piece of fabric she recognized immediately. Mike's jacket. She turned to run, but the Goatman moved faster, stepping into her path. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and its voice rumbled deep and mocking. "You called for him, and now he's mine," it growled. Jenna tried to scream, but no sound came out. Behind her, the effigy began to creak and shift, its wooden limbs cracking as if coming to life. The air grew thick with a suffocating cold, the temperature dropping so quickly that Jenna's breath turned into visible fog. The Goatman stood still, its towering form seemingly unfazed by the chill. Its eyes glowed with that sickly yellow light, but now there was something new. A gleam of malicious satisfaction in its gaze. Jenna felt the weight of its presence, like something ancient, something that had always been there, just waiting for her. The effigy behind her began to twist, the wooden joints snapping as it came to life. Its goat-like features contorted into a grotesque parody of human movement, the bones creaking and popping as it stood looming above her. Its hollow, empty eyes were filled with a strange, dark energy, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. Suddenly, the Goatman moved. It lunged at her with the speed of a predator, its clawed hands wrapping around her throat before she could react. The air was knocked from her lungs as its grip tightened, its nails digging into her skin. Jenna struggled, kicking and clawing at its arm, but her strength was no match for the creature. She could feel the life draining out of her, the darkness creeping in around the edges of her vision. The world started to blur, and her thoughts became muddled, the sound of her heartbeat thumping in her ears. Then, in a cruel twist, the creature released her, just enough for her to gasp in a breath, only to be met with a chilling whisper in her ear. "You should have listened." The Goatman stepped back, its twisted grin widening even further as it looked toward the effigy. With a sudden jerking motion, the effigy's wooden arms stretched out, and it reached for the jacket that lay draped over it. The fabric began to twitch, as if something inside the effigy was awakening. Jenna turned her head just in time to see the jacket move on its own, twisting as if some kind of grotesque puppet was trapped inside it. The dark figure inside stirred, and the unmistakable outline of Mike's face began to emerge from the rags. His eyes wide open, but they were empty, pale, lifeless, like two hollow sockets staring into her soul. Mike's body convulsed as he pulled himself from the effigy, his limbs jerking like a marionette controlled by strings. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a twisted, garbled rasp that was more insect-like than human. "Mike? No?" Jenna whispered, but her voice was barely audible, drowned out by the horrible noise that filled the air. The Goatman stepped closer, its laughter booming as it observed the transformation. Mike's body, now no longer his own, moved toward her, its limbs snapping into unnatural positions. His mouth formed a smile, but the eyes were dead. "You called for him," the Goatman said, its voice growing colder, darker. "And now, he's nothing more than a puppet for my amusement." Jenna's pulse raced, and the terror that gripped her chest felt suffocating, almost unbearable. Mike's face, his once warm, friendly face, was now a grotesque, empty mask, and his body continued to twitch in unsettling, jerking motions. The Goatman stepped back, its head tilted in amusement, as Jenna stumbled to her feet, trying to escape. But she was too slow. She felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, spinning her around to face Mike. His dead, hollow eyes locked onto hers. And for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of recognition. Jenna. He rasped, but the voice was distorted. Wrong. I'm sorry. Then, in an instant, the creature that had once been Mike lunged forward, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Jenna screamed as its jaws closed around her. And the world went black. The campfire crackled in the distance as the wind whispered through the trees. But there was no one left to hear it. The whispering woods had claimed two more souls, their cries swallowed by the endless dark. And somewhere, deep within the woods, the Goatman waited.